And thank you for joining us today for our final panel discussion of the Fair Housing Film Festival. I'm really excited for this one. I hope you were able to tune into our webinar before this, featuring Natalie, who you'll meet in a minute, as well as a wonderful short film by the Maryland Historical Society that David, who you'll also meet, helped to make. So at this time, I'm honored to introduce our moderator, who I can say has been a wonderful partner to the Baltimore Office of Equity and Civil Rights, who, with her help, we've trained 122 first-time homebuyers in fair housing this past year. So Miss Chloe Williams. Miss Williams is a Philadelphia native. She moved to Baltimore in 2000 and started working at Enterprise Social Investment Corporation, Enterprise Homes, as a housing development coordinator in Baltimore and Washington, D.C., which included such developments as Heritage Crossing in Baltimore and Wheeler Creek in Southeast D.C. In her current role, Ms. Williams serves as the Director of Housing Counseling and Homeownership Opportunities at Druid Heights Community Development Corporation. Ms. Williams manages the marketing and sales for their affordable new construction townhomes and fully renovated brownstones developed in Druid Heights. She also directs the First-Time Homebuyers program, focusing on credit building, money management, and more. Her other specialties include being a certified reverse mortgage counselor and a certified financial coach. She loves to travel and has been married for 20 years. At this time, I'd love to introduce Ms. Williams.
Well, thank you, Lauren, and welcome everyone. As she mentioned, day 5, the concluding panel discussion, so it's going to be a lively one. As the description mentioned, when it comes to the history of housing discrimination, we cannot simply leave the past in the past. In order to truly understand everything from disparities in health, education, and wealth, we must start with the systems that contributed to those disparities. In the case of housing discrimination, policies like redlining and racially restrictive covenants and deeds. This lively discussion is going to be joined with us with the panelists, Natalie Gillard, I want to get that right. And she's the founder and facilitator of Factuality the Game. And we're also joined by David Armenti, Director of Education at the Maryland Historical Society, as they show us historical documents that demonstrate firsthand these discriminatory practices, and we're going to discuss the modern day outcomes. We will learn about the resources available from both panelists that seek to bring history to life through a variety of educational approaches. So first, I'll talk a little bit about David Armenti. He's a Baltimore City native and current Mount Washington resident, whose parents were both educators in the city public school system for over 30 years. How wonderful is that? After graduating from Baltimore Polytechnic Institute, he went on to receive his BA in American History and American Studies from the University of Maryland, College Park. There, he studied the social history of the United States, focusing on its complex racial and ethnic dynamics. Mr. Armenti also completed the Master's of Arts in Teaching at Loyola University, becoming a state-certified social studies educator for grades 7 through 12. He then worked as a research archivist for the Maryland State Archives Legacy of Slavery Project, documenting historical examples of resistance among enslaved African Americans in Maryland. As the Director of Education at the Maryland Historical Society, Mr. Armenti specializes in bringing the state's unique history to life, using primary source collections to guide inquiry-based learning for students and teachers. He has worked within Maryland's high school education department for more than 7 years, developing an expertise in local resources that inform investigations of topics such as African American history, labor and political organizing, and the civil rights movement. So we look forward to hearing from David. We're also joined by Natalie Gillard. During her undergraduate experience, Natalie found that support for individuals from diverse backgrounds was rather limited. The latter ignited her desire to pursue diverse professional opportunities and a self-designed graduate study in race and ethnic relations. Natalie has held various inclusion roles over her 13-year career, most recently serving as Stevenson University's Assistant Vice President for Multicultural Experience. Natalie is the creator of Factuality, a facilitated dialogue crash course and interactive experience that simulates structural inequality in America. Factuality has supported the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives of Fortune 500 companies like Google, Lockheed Martin, Bloomberg Industry Group, the College Board, the American Heart Association, the National Institutes of Health, Bill Gates Millennium Scholars, Princeton, UCLA, and the University of Arizona, where author and civil rights activist Bell Hooks participated. Factuality has reached over 20,000 participants. Congratulations, Natalie. And it was featured in Amazon's bestseller, The Memo: What Women of Color Need to Know to Secure a Seat at the Table, Baltimore Magazine's Best of Baltimore issue, the Afro-American newspaper, the Johns Hopkins newsletter, and the Baltimore Jewish Times. Factuality is listed in the Kellogg Foundation's Racial and Equity Resource Guide and became an ice cream flavor through a partnership with social justice ice cream brand Taharka Brothers. How exciting is that? So now that we know a little bit about them, let's start by giving them an opportunity to tell us a little bit about themselves and how they became involved in work around the history of housing discrimination. So David, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thank you so much, Ms. Williams, and hello to everybody out there who's tuning in. So as was mentioned, a lot of my work and a lot of my interest in this area is grounded in my experience and residency here in Baltimore and in Maryland. So being a lifelong Baltimore resident, it was always very clear the divisions that existed in communities here and how that impacted the experience of people navigating those lines. And it, even as a young person, it was something that I was cognizant of, and not knowing necessarily what the history was behind that, but certainly recognizing what the impact was and how that might have intersected with the unique history here. So it was always something that was on my mind, even as a young learner coming up in Baltimore. And therefore I decided to look into that further as a career and as in my studies in undergraduate, as well as my graduate work in education. So focusing on American history, but bringing that personal angle to light, was always a strong focus of mine, whether that was in undergraduate, looking at the resegregation of schools in the Baltimore area for my senior thesis, diving into primary source records, whether that be institutional records, newspapers, and a variety of other sources that are really able to illuminate those topics in a way that you're not really going to get from secondary material, and certainly students and teachers are not going to get from their textbook. So bringing that background into my professional life, getting into K-12 education, but also marrying that with the interest in the use of archival resources, again, first at the Maryland State Archives, and then really capitalizing on that through my work at the Maryland Historical Society over the last 7+ years. It's really been a fascinating journey to build that resource toolkit and structure experiences for students as well as educators and the general public to bring this history to light and try to design it in a way where different learners from different backgrounds can hopefully gain some sort of understanding that goes beyond just names and dates on the page, and allows us to connect that to the contemporary environment that we're in. So that was my journey to this point, and it's really been interesting to continue to work in that direction.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today. And now, Natalie, how about you?
So, hi everyone, happy to be with you today. Ms. Williams, thank you so much for that incredible tone setting with the introduction. You made me feel even more excited about my participation. So thank you so much. So what really grounded me in this work was honestly this never ending frustration that I began to feel from when I was a child, from knowing that I was Black as early as 5 or 6 years old because of the way other kids would receive me or say things to me. That was frustrating. Or living in the suburbs of the city in Massachusetts and feeling frustrated because in the winter, school was closed in the suburbs, but open in the city where I went to school, which had everything to do with neighborhood temperatures. So I was curious as to why I would get more snow. So I was frustrated because as a kid, I don't want to go to school. So frustrations that followed me into my career, I decided that I felt frustrated with the lack of engagement in what I think is the most important conversation to have. How could you subject me to all of these awful things because of my Blackness, but then not want to have a conversation with me about it? That doesn't make sense. And so it was the frustration that led me to developing diversity initiatives and more frustration because the people who needed to have the conversation the most never showed up. And I realized that it had a lot to do with the content and the ways in which the content was delivered. And so that led me to trying to find better ways to engage even the most resistant, which led me to creating Factuality, which is a simulation of structural inequities. And so I figured if I try to gamify a conversation, I might get more people on board with having it. And so the issues I would encounter when I first started doing this work is that I don't want to have the conversation. I don't want to be lectured at. I don't want to have it all day. Well, show up and have this conversation, but don't be yourself. Be a different identity. In fact, that's required. And secondly, in place of me lecturing to you, let me tell you a story. I'm going to present the facts to you in a story. And then lastly, I'm only going to keep you for 90 minutes. There's brevity. And I promise you what happens now is that the same people who would be most resistant are like, we didn't have enough time to have this discussion. So I'm not feeling as frustrated anymore. It's shifting, but that's where it all began. It was just all these different iterations of frustration that followed me since I was a child around things that didn't make sense to me and the lack of engagement in a conversation that we all need to have. And so that led me to Factuality, which is turning 5 and has been full time since 2018.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. Okay, well, we're going to jump right in. And I do encourage all of the participants and those who have joined us today, if you have questions, please type them into the chat box. We're going to be answering those as we move throughout this panel discussion. But we'll get started with David. Can you please give us a brief history of discriminatory housing practices prior to 1930?
I like that you said brief, and I will do my best to keep it to that. But as anybody who's talked to a historian before knows, if you get them going, sometimes it's hard to stop. However, I as well encourage my colleagues here on the panel to interject or interrupt as needed to either ask clarifying questions or reframe it if there's something you want to add or a tangent off of that. So please do so.
Practices
So I think one
to
of the first
1930.
important things to understand from a historical perspective, and probably a misconception by many folks when it comes to race relations and those dynamics, particularly as it relates to housing, is that this developed naturally, organically, or that it was the decision only of the people who were moving into these areas, that they either wanted to be separate or that it was just some sort of accident that happened. That is very far from the case. Much of what we still see currently, and certainly in the early 20th century, the segregation and discriminatory tactics were by design, and often coming from governmental forces or people in power, not just personal decisions by people that had prejudice. So I want to start by saying that first and foremost. But also at the same time, in a place like Baltimore, the level of division and segregation was not always as high as it would become in the early 20th century. So you actually had some relative level of integrated housing if you're looking at the city in the 19th century, so in the 1800s. Even going back to the time before enslavement was abolished, before 1864, there were instances of integrated housing in the sense that in the same neighborhood, within the same block, you might have people of different races, different ethnicities, speaking different languages within that same block, or at least within that adjacent block. Often what we learn about with Baltimore history is that it was the alley houses or some of these smaller row house communities that may have been occupied by new immigrants as well as free African American communities, and in some cases even enslaved people of African descent that were living in those communities in Baltimore. So it was not always what we would see later on. In fact, it was the emancipation and the end of slavery that actually brought this issue more to the forefront and led to some reactionary politics and policies by various entities. So when emancipation occurred, Baltimore, like Washington, D.C., like Philadelphia, even Annapolis, some of these areas in the mid-Atlantic were often the receiving end of an influx of population. People that had been formerly enslaved no longer wanted to remain in those same rural communities where former masters lived and where they knew they were in danger or may even just fall back into some of the same employment options, which were very limited. So a large number of people came to Baltimore in particular, and very, very soon after the war, you start to see the amount of housing being limited and not being able to accommodate not just those formerly enslaved African American people, but other population at that time. So you start to see more of the modern set of discriminatory tactics taking shape. And certainly as we move toward the turn of the century, this would become more formal policy. And what I'm going to do here in a moment is share my screen to show some original primary sources, some of which are part of the Maryland Historical Society collection. Some are also from newspaper collections. So I'm just going to take a moment here to switch over to that. And then I'm going to talk about a few of these documents before Natalie gets a chance to take over and provide some more context for us.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, so Natalie and Ms. Williams, are we seeing the newspaper article that I have on display here? Awesome.
Yes, looks great.
So yeah, looks great, but the content not so honorable when it comes to looking at the history of our city here. So Baltimore has the notorious designation of adopting one of the, if not the first racial segregation law in terms of housing that was set forth by members of the city council and adopted at various levels. So what you're seeing here is actually a newspaper article from the New York Times, which is outlining the Baltimore Plan, what would also be referred to as the West Plan, and some various other titles that was put forth by leadership, white leadership within the city. So the catalyst for this was that upwardly mobile African Americans, namely George W. McMechen and his law partner W. Ashby Hawkins. Hawkins had purchased a home within the, depending on what you might call the neighborhood name, but it's either Druid Heights, Upton, that area of what was then the northwest reaches of the city on McCullough Street. Hawkins purchased a home. He rented it to his law partner, McMechen, and their family. And immediately this was perceived as a problem by the white members of that community. It did not matter that these were college-educated men with families who had the money and the means to get what they wanted from housing, and they chose what was then an upper crust neighborhood of the city. And not only was there this backlash on a personal level, but some of the people in that community took it upon themselves to take it to the city council level and try to get things changed. And they did. So ultimately, what the West Plan would do was create a stipulation where if a block was more than 50% white or more than 50% Black, people of the opposite race, as they deemed it, were not allowed to move onto that block. Now let's think about that for a second. It is a bizarre construction of a law, very difficult to enforce, constitutionally dubious, and because of that, it was challenged multiple times. And even it was challenged from a legal perspective by Hawkins and others, some within the local NAACP as he was affiliated. However, the people that were putting forth the law, including Councilman West and some of his allies that we can see here, they changed the letter of the law to try to get it to fit the legal needs and the constitutional needs. And they tried to implement it. And they tried to enforce it. Again, very difficult to enforce. Fines were levied in a few different cases, but for the most part, there was just such difficulty in trying to say what was a white block versus what was a Black block and those terms, because those dynamics, those demographics were gradually shifting over the years. So it was a flawed law, but one that the powers that be, the white male power structure at that time, were very insistent that they were going to get this through. And it actually became a model for other cities across the country. And even international observers were looking at Baltimore as a pioneer, if you will, of racial segregation and how to impose that on a legal basis. At the same time, and I know this too as well, you have private neighborhoods that were establishing what would be known as covenants or agreements. So what you see here is the front page of the deed and agreement of the Roland Park Company for the Guilford neighborhood. And the Roland Park Company, as some folks may know, managed and developed many of the communities along what is now the northern edge of the community. So not just the city, that is, not just Guilford, but Roland Park and some others that were in that vicinity. And they were very specific about who was supposed to live there. Now, it's worth noting that Baltimore, in a sense, would develop a three-tiered system, not just Black and white, but you would have Jewish Baltimoreans that, in a sense, occupied a third rung or a middle ground there between them. There was a gentleman's agreement in Roland Park that while there were a few Jewish residents, current residents would not continue to sell to Jewish Baltimoreans. But for African Americans, it was much more specific. And if you can make out that middle paragraph, and I know Natalie has another really interesting example of this. The previous page puts all of these into the category of nuisances. So we should all take a moment to absorb that as well. But I'll read the text. At no time shall the land therein included in said tract or any part thereof, or any building erected thereon, be occupied by any Negro or person of Negro extraction. This prohibition, however, is not intended to include the occupancy by a Negro domestic servant or other person, while employed in or about the premises by the owner or occupant of any land included in said tract. So you can be here if you're working for them, but if you want to own this home, if you want to rent this home, that's not going to fly. And the people that moved into the community would either literally sign or tacitly agree to this policy. And these types of covenants as well were modeled and replicated around the country. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that Baltimore is on the middle ground on a lot of these issues. You know, we talk about Baltimore being northern and southern, but we pioneered some of the most shameful ways of implementing this sort of separation, and it was not by accident. So I will have some opportunity to share some other primary source documents throughout the course of the hour, but I want to say a few more words and then try to shift it over to my colleagues. So these types of policies would continue even though the constitutional challenges were there. Ultimately, this was deemed unconstitutional, the law that the city council implemented, but that did not stop communities from moving forward with more of these private agreements, as well as real estate agents putting their mark on it by not even considering the ability or the promotion of having integrated neighborhoods. So that's some of the historical context of what was unique about Baltimore and some of the case studies that really illuminate that here. So I'm going to unshare my screen. And we can go from there.
Okay. Well, thank you, David. Wow. And I know this is going to come up again as we move through the discussion and the questions are coming in, but thank you for getting us started, I tell you. So Natalie, we'll move to you since David brought us up to the practices through 1930. Why don't we ask you if you could talk us through the history of housing discrimination from the 1930s onward and include some of the modern day outcomes that we see from those discriminatory practices, even that David described.
Sure, I'd be happy to. It's one of my favorite things to do, actually. So I'm going to share my screen as well. And so the way I get to allow people to see this is through experiential learning, through factuality. And in the midst of the pandemic, I transitioned into what is now called Just the Facts. It's the core components of the program and in the midst of the absence of the game board and all the accompanying pieces. And when I get to this section around redlining, whatever city I'm working with, whatever group I'm working with, I'll pull their map. There's a really great resource called Mapping Inequality, where all of these maps are housed. There's over 200 of them. And so I'll start off by asking the group, have you ever seen this map before? If you have, put yes into the chat box. If you have not, put no. And it's not uncommon to see a bunch of no's, but I'm so happy to share that we are moving into a place where this is becoming more common knowledge, where I do see a lot of yeses that are emerging in the chat box the more I dive into this body of work with factuality. And so I'll have people, they say their yeses or their nos, and then I begin to share the history of these maps. And so in the 1930s and under the Franklin Roosevelt administration, under that presidency, was the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And they were responsible for creating a series of these maps of every metropolitan or city-like area in this entire country, shading in red all the areas where Black, African American, or the equivalent derogatory term resided. And so you could see below this map is a color code. And so the colors on this map, that's what the code means. So green is best, blue is still desirable, yellow definitely declining, and red hazardous. And so to take it a step further, I took this map of Baltimore from the 1930s and I superimposed it against the current neighborhood composition and was able to extract areas that were originally redlined that remain people of color and remain low income decades later, almost 100 years later. And so first we established the creation of these maps. And again, over 200, I've read that there's as many as 239. And David could fact check us, fact check us here. So over 200 of these maps were created. And when the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, came into being, they would create policies that would intentionally restrict Black home ownership. And that could occur and would occur through failing to insure Black home loans, as well as failing to allocate funding to developers who had intentions of making homes for Black people. That was against the law. And then when World War II ended, when the vets returned, Black vets were deemed ineligible for the VA benefits because the VA adopted the FHA policies, which meant that Black vets were not offered the educational benefits of the VA loan, nor were they offered the benefits for home ownership. So here are our origins of the achievement gap and the wealth gap. And so oftentimes when we have this conversation, you'll hear a couple of people say, who need a little bit more love and education, this was so long ago, it's the past, get over it, I didn't own slaves. Yeah. Sure, it is not that long ago. You may not have owned slaves, but it is not that long ago. There are people who are alive that can talk about the implications of this, the repercussions of this. And if that is the case, then it means it is not that long ago. And so for those individuals who say, oh, it's so long ago, get over it, or the equivalent, well, there is a legacy between the past and the present. There is a legacy. We have individual legacies. We have family legacies. Our corporations and institutions have legacies. So why can't the policy of this country have a legacy too? It does. And so again, I ask the participants, are you familiar with this map? And then I'll share some additional maps and I ask them if they can find the relationship between the maps that are going to follow this page. And so what we can see here is a map of St. Louis and Detroit. And so you'll see, especially on the St. Louis map, that at the bottom here, where it's all the concentration of the red spaces, it's all grayed out because that's an industrial zone. It was not uncommon to intentionally place Black people next to industrial zones and water areas, and that compromises your quality of air. Now, the intentionality around placing Black people next to the water is that it was gross by the water back then. Think about the time, think about the industry. We had ships coming in with all different types of goods, inclusive of meats. And when that would spoil or rot, it would smell. So the stench from the water and the fumes of that time, it was unattractive. But then now we're seeing a lot of gentrification by waterfronts because it's desirable space. The industry has shifted. It also wasn't common, as we're thinking about the zoning, it wasn't common to just plop a highway right in the middle of an area, raise an area where Black families lived and move them out of that space to put a highway. Especially in Baltimore, we have Route 40, it's a highway to nowhere. So you moved all these families out of the way and put in these major highways and interstates. And all it did was displace families. People haven't recovered. When you take Route 40 over into West Baltimore, those areas haven't recovered. It's all by design. So again, thinking of the commonalities between the cities, St. Louis, Detroit, Baltimore, and Memphis. And I ask them, what do these cities have in common? And I'll see highways and water and concentrated areas for Black people. We have Kansas City and Little Rock. Milwaukee and Rockford. And I'm still asking, we're looking for one more piece. What is the relationship between all of these cities? David, you can't guess. Cleveland and Stockton. And when I get here, if I don't get the response I'm looking for, and there's a lot of responses that are accurate, but the main commonality between all of these cities is that these are the cities with the highest crime rates in the United States. Top 10, in the order in which we went through the slides, they all have a correlating redlining map. You can't say that this is that long ago and get over it. When we see a relationship between the past and the present, that is the legacy. These are the cities with the highest crime rates in the United States. To bring it more, like my friends, my good friends at Baltimore County Public Schools, they'll say, to bring it more personal, local, and immediate, let's make draw some correlations between the past and what just happened to George Floyd. In the first image, we are seeing a redlining map of Memphis. Do we see this on the screen? Did it shift?
We can see it.
Okay, great, thank you.
And
So-
Natalie,
Yeah.
before you continue, could you remind the audience of where you found these maps that you're showing now?
Absolutely, I'll actually discuss it on the very next page. So what we're seeing here is Minneapolis, the redlining map of Minneapolis, and a screen grab from Google Maps. And I put these red lines here just to give you a sense of accuracy between the two because they look different. Now this first redlined map is showing us the first significant curve in the Mississippi River. And the second red line is demonstrating the second most significant curve in the Mississippi River. And this third red line is the intersection in which George Floyd was murdered in its correlating area on a red line map, right by the industrial zone. In the third image, immediately this looks like a formerly redlined space because there's no trees. Our environmental protectants signify what areas are redlined and what areas had advantages. We see a piece of tree in the background, but there are no trees in this immediate area. Fourth image, third map. I put this white arrow here just to give us an idea of the vicinity where George Floyd was murdered. And in accordance with the Center for Homicide Research, it states that the average homicide location has been calculated to display a possible positive correlation between homicides and alcohol. The average location has been found to lay right over the highest concentration of liquor being sold in the city. And if I may steal one of David's words, I'm going to marry this for you. I'm going to marry the relationship between liquor and homicides and redlined areas and zoning and industrial spaces. So I'm going to read quickly from The Color of Law. Very great read. I don't know how my book is still bound. The amount of times I shut this book so harshly out of frustration. Again, that frustration has followed me. In addition to promoting segregation, zoning decisions contributed to degrading African-American neighborhoods into slums. Not only were these neighborhoods zoned to permit industry, even polluting industry, but the Plan Commission permitted taverns, liquor stores, nightclubs, and houses of prostitution to open in African-American neighborhoods, but prohibited these as zoning violations in neighborhoods where whites lived. Those are the facts. That's the history. Now, again, in honor of my BCPS family, I would say at this point, personal, local, and immediate. Baltimore Street in Baltimore is a strip of strip clubs that was permitted and prohibited in white spaces. It is not uncommon to see in formerly redlined spaces an influx of liquor stores. So much so that we'll just see liquor in the title of that store. And so now we're seeing that there is a relationship between liquor and homicides in the areas that were zoned, and in the industry and the pollution and the murder of George Floyd. It is all interconnected. And the intentionality behind this, because David and I are only giving you a snapshot, will blow your mind. I got all of this data from Mapping Inequality, very great resource. This is what it looks like across the nation. All of these big circles of red and yellow has a correlating map. Think about the areas where we have high crime, high poverty, poor schools. It is all interconnected. And now let's get really local. So you're gonna see something really familiar because of course these popped up all around the country. These are the deeds, agreements, restrictive covenants. I like to call them racial covenants. I have this document. In the home that I'm speaking from, I own this home that has the same language that David just read. Essentially that I could not be here because I'm Black unless I was the help like my next door neighbor who is a Black senior citizen who before I received this document told me that she was able to access this neighborhood because she started off as the help. And when the woman that she was caring for passed away, she left her the home. And as more Black people began to access this neighborhood because they started off as the Negro domestic servants, it triggered what is called white flight. Too many Black people in the neighborhood triggered white flight. The white neighbors left. And that is the history of this house that I own. And so David mentioned that, yes, it is under the subheading of no nuisances, but let me tell you what was also included in no nuisances right before no Negroes. Cattle yard, hog pen, fowl yard, fowl house, and cesspool. And then people like me. So it's that dehumanization that leads us to the present challenges. Let's talk about the present challenges. So the legacy of residential segregation has implications for where you go to school, its racial diversity, the quality of the education you receive, access to employment opportunities, access to healthy food, the quality of your neighborhood, your housing conditions, your property taxes, how much lead exposure you have, the quality of the air you breathe, the likelihood of having asthma, the quality of your mental health, the temperature of your neighborhood, the frequency in which that neighborhood is policed. I mean, this is a snapshot of the list. That's all I could fit on the page, and I ran out of space. And now in closing, NPR did us a big favor. They pulled together aggregate data and was on the ground conducting this experiment around neighborhood temperatures. And as you could see, Broadway East has always been on the cusp of definitely declining and hazardous. And Roland Park has always been on the cusp of green best and blue still desirable. So the absence of the trees, again, signifies formerly redlined spaces. In my neighborhood, we have big, beautiful trees and front lawns and backyards because of white flight. So when I see trees, it tells me the history of who was once allowed, who was never allowed, and who perhaps may have fled. When the sun is beaming down on pavement, it increases the neighborhood temperatures and it triggers respiratory challenges. And now that collides with a respiratory health crisis. And when the sun is beaming down on these beautiful tree canopies that have matured over the last 8 decades, it offers cooling. And in a conversation I got to have with David last week, I said to him, I'm hearing a lot of oral history. My participants are saying that the homes were advertised as vacation homes in the Roland Park, Mount Washington area. Some of the homes were, and he said, yeah, that's true. It was cooler. Not all of the homes, but some of the homes could have been advertised as vacation homes. And the advertisements back then, what I'm hearing from my participants is that it was offered as a way to escape the city heat. We knew that it was cooler and that the trees offered that cooling. This has implications not just for Black people, but also for Jewish communities as well. Oftentimes in the deeds of the homes, and my participants have told me they have found, Jewish participants have found deeds to the homes that would say that the home could not be sold to any Jew or Hebrew. And then I'm supposed to stay in the 1930s, but I will close by saying that this also had major implications for Asian people, as there were acts that would bar Asian people from migrating into the United States in the 1920s. Think about the relationship between that past policy and how small that population is present day. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie.
if you don't mind, if I could just add a couple quick pieces that really sparked in my mind from what Natalie was discussing. I know we're coming up against time a little bit, so I'll try to be quick. We cannot ignore the impact of the lack of economic opportunity, something that she alluded to. World War II was mentioned. Even during the war in Baltimore, the Federal Housing Administration had efforts to build housing for many of the incoming African American migrants who were working in the factories. They were discriminated against in the factories, and they were discriminated against in terms of finding housing and even the ability to build new housing that was funded. This was not something that they needed resources for. But areas of Northeast Baltimore around the Herring Run region, massive protests from the white population. Over 1,000 people came out to say, we don't want them here. Bel Air Road, Herring Run corridor. This is part of the origins of the Cherry Hill neighborhood in South Baltimore, which was specifically built and designed for workers coming up in the World War II era, and those veterans that Natalie mentioned coming back. And we can't disconnect not just the lack of opportunity and access for economics in World War II, but what does home ownership mean for wealth continuing into today? This is well documented that our grandparents and great grandparents who were able to, and when I say our, I suppose I'm referring to white Americans, were able to especially begin building that generational wealth that still sustains today. And much of that was derived from the dynamics that Natalie was talking about during the World War II period. And another aspect that I don't want to ignore is race-based violence and vigilante justice on the part of people that wanted to keep others out. We know some of the major case studies like Chicago, like East St. Louis, where this type of bitterness around incoming populations, particularly African Americans, led to rioting. It led to murder in a way that we don't necessarily address that as much as we should within the history textbooks. Now, we don't see as much of that here in Baltimore's history, but that threat of violence, that othering that really kept integration from happening was very strong. So it was at the policy level as well as at that personal level where those hardening of lines was something that occurred here very strongly as well.
Okay. Well, thank you. I tell you, it just amazing the correlations that you both have brought to light as far as the zoning laws and things of that nature, and how they have impacted and correlate to the higher crime rates. Just very interesting. And so with that, there was a question from the audience because we talk about, for whom are these, is this information important? And the audience asked the question to Natalie, do you see any limitations in corporate focused training? Do you think that the corporate trainings are going to lead to power or equity for people of color? Or do you think it's just an awareness, woke, as they say?
I think it's a fusion. If you're going to enact change, then you have to be aware of what you need to enact change for. So I do this facilitation in corporate settings, and I'll have people get back to me telling me that they are reconfiguring the racial composition of their search committees, for instance, or looking at the salaries across racial and gender lines and just trying to figure out ways to become more equitable. But it starts off with awareness, so it's a fusion of the two, but you need the awareness first to do anything beyond that.
Absolutely. And so that takes care of the corporate piece. But David, who would you say, and just briefly share with us, who would you say it's important to focus on when it comes to educating individuals on this topic?
Well, I should start by saying that there's value in every segment of the population getting tuned in on this information and coming up with various calls to action. But one of the areas that I focus on through my work at the Maryland Historical Society is the K-12 educational community. So that's students as young as 4th, 5th, 6th grade, understanding the origins of the communities that they come from. That, again, this negative perception, particularly by students who live in communities in Baltimore, it's become ingrained in them. And it's unfortunate to see that they are still in need of tools to see this is not something that you created. This is not something that your parents created. Let's show and let's connect this to the national narrative. Let's find ways to link this into local curriculum, which I think a lot of educators are very focused on and we're appreciative of. Show them these original primary sources, like those from our collection, some that Natalie have featured, to say that, again, these dynamics have come by design. They've been imposed from the federal, state, and city level, as well as by private individuals. So I think for me, it's extremely valuable to get those young minds understanding that there's an origin to what you see around you, as well as the educators that are working with them. And I think within Baltimore, and even some of the surrounding areas, we know that some educators may not be from that community. They may not have the history of that community or the tools to take social studies curriculum and embed some of the local case studies into that. So a big part of our role as museum educators, and I know many of my colleagues in the field do similar things, is to show them how to make those connections, provide the primary sources that can illuminate it, as well as the instructional framework to do so in an intelligent way. So that's my goal, and that's what we try to provide through our work.
Okay. And now, Natalie, how about for you? What would your call to action be?
Make sure that in any iteration of the way you receive this information, that it's only a pit stop on a longer equity journey. Your equity journey has to follow you across the span of your entire life. We have a tendency to center the people who are subjected to these traumatic things. But it's happening in real time. So we also have to center the inflictors. We have to center who is contributing to this in real time. So just make sure that you lean into this conversation, you dive all the way in. It is not always going to be comfortable, but anything that we really strive to achieve, it's not necessarily comfortable even outside of a conversation around racial equity. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't show up and have the conversation. The data states that we thrive in multicultural environments, which means that everyone has to do their part in order for us to all be able to thrive. So just make sure that if this is the beginning of your journey today with us, thank you for showing up. Don't let it be your last stop.
What should they do next? What would you say?
I would say start using your voice. Don't stay silent when you see things that are harmful occurring, because it definitely demonstrates that you are being complicit. Hold yourself accountable, hold your loved ones accountable. When you become acquainted with your biases, just hold on to them and begin to unlearn them. Don't run away from them. That's not the way to get this done. It's not going to feel good. Read, there's really great books. I held up The Color of Law, lean into that book. I also am reading, right now I'm reading How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's showing me that I have a lot of work to do. So knowing even as a practitioner, I get this wrong, everyone's getting it wrong, and there's room for all of us to grow. So that would be easy ways to be able to mitigate this. There's plenty of content out there. Choose something. It might feel overwhelming. Just choose something. Choose one thing and continue to educate yourself.
Awesome. David?
If I could really quickly add
Yes.
to, I know we're low on time, but
Yes.
the complicity, the historic complicity of government at various levels, as well as private individuals, needs to be acknowledged, and there are action steps. So for whether that is voting for the people that would have your interests in the interests of the larger community at heart, but even more specifically, pushing current elected officials and government entities to invest in a way that can start to rectify some of the historical disadvantages that have been placed on formerly redlined communities. Because Natalie, I think, very clearly displayed how that connection leads to some of the disparities that we still see today. So it's not something that's just in the past. Put that pressure, take those steps, and acknowledge those in your own life and what your impact can be.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us today for this lively discussion. And as we said, there is more room to grow. Take care.